Ahead on Black News Tonight, another no-verdict day for the jury deliberating in the manslaughter case against former suburban Minnesota police officer Kim Potter, who fatally shot Dante Wright during a traffic stop earlier this year. We'll give you the latest. Plus, the African Union's decision over the summer to accept Israel as an observer state receives two total opposite responses from the United States and South Africa, whose chief rabbi also has some harsh words about Israel's recent Omicron ban against the Jewish diaspora. We'll revisit my conversation with the famous Kenyan lawyer and Pan-Africanist, Professor PLO Lumumba. And former NBA star Steve Francis is appealing to black men about their mental health, why he's urging them to make it a priority. Black News Tonight starts now. Good evening and thank you for joining me on Black News Tonight. I'm Marc Lamont Hill. A jury remains undecided as it reviews the manslaughter case against Kim Potter, the former suburban Minneapolis police officer who shot and killed 20-year-old Dante Wright during a traffic stop in Brooklyn Center. The jury that includes only one black person must decide if Potter is guilty of two manslaughter charges in the killing of Wright back on April 11th. Potter's defense is that she mistook her handgun for her taser during the fatal incident. In order to convict her of first-degree manslaughter, jurors must agree that she caused Wright's death while recklessly handling a firearm. For the second-degree manslaughter conviction, they must agree Potter acted with culpable negligence. Over in Washington State, two police officers have been cleared in the death of Manuel Ellis, a 33-year-old black man. Tacoma Police announced that after a thorough review by Internal Affairs, Officer Messiah Ford and Armando Farinas have been exonerated from any policy violations in the death of Ellis in March of 2020. In video recordings of the incident, officers can be seen pinning Ellis to the ground at a street corner as he says, "I can't breathe, sir, I can't breathe," shortly before losing consciousness. According to officials, lack of oxygen, methamphetamine, and heart disease were the causes behind Ellis's death. The officers cleared in his death will now undergo training before returning to duty. A Kentucky task force is recommending changes to policing in the state following the shooting death of Breonna Taylor. The task force on search warrants is suggesting additional training for officers, an electronic database, and the tracking of zip codes where authorities carry out search warrants. Kentucky Attorney General Daniel Cameron pushed for the creation of the task force last year after his office completed a review of the incident that occurred on March 13, 2020, when authorities stormed Taylor's apartment and fatally shot the 26-year-old medical technician. Joining me now to talk about all of these stories is BNC Chief Legal Correspondent Laura McNeil. Good to see you as always, Dr. Laura. Let's start off with the case of Kim Potter. We heard during the trial that officers on the scene feared that Dante Wright would drive away during the stop if Potter didn't make a move to stop him. What is the likelihood that the jurors will buy that story and rule in favor of Potter?
Mark, if you had asked me this question before Kim Potter took the stand, I would have said absolutely not. But it is possible that they might rule in her favor because of the fact that she was able to kind of reproduce, as we're seeing there in that video footage, tears. Now, some people, of course, say they don't actually see any tears falling. But, you know, the jury responds to that kind of stuff. They respond to a defendant showing remorse because often defendants don't even take the witness stand from the beginning. But I think because she said it was an accident, because this is not a police officer that has a prior history of misconduct, it's the first time she shot her gun in 26 years, I think there's a strong possibility that she's either going to be acquitted or there's going to be a hung jury because they're already asking the judge, the jury members, what do we do if we can't reach a decision? For any defense attorney, they know that that is a sure sign that it's possible there's going to be a hung jury because they simply can't decide whether or not her mistake, as she says, is culpable negligence for a criminal punishment.
Now, the jury asked to hold Kim Potter's gun, but the defense objected. What was each side trying to do there?
Yeah, so essentially the defense is saying, no, we don't want them to do that because they don't want the jury members to see the obvious that we all see Mark, which is there's a huge difference between a bright yellow taser and a firearm. So the jury members want to hold that firearm. The prosecution wants them to hold that firearm so they can see the difference in the weight, so they can see that with the bright yellow taser, there's an LED screen on it. There's also a flashlight on it. Again, there's a difference in the feel of the grip to show that her actions, Kim Potter's actions, were not reasonable, especially for a 26-year-old veteran who was so good that she was a field training officer. So the defense wants to keep that out at all costs. The judge, we know, said no, it is more than it is okay and acceptable for these jury members to go ahead and take they have some little zip ties essentially on her firearm to take it out of the witness box and see what it feels like.
Out of all the evidence presented during Potter's trial, what is the most damaging?
I would say hands down, it's going to be when the prosecution showed the still shots of the actual attempt to arrest Daunte Wright, showing a series of bad choices that Kim Potter made from the beginning of her shift when she didn't follow her own PD's policy and test her taser before the start of the shift, to showing the still shots of her actually shooting the taser under Officer Lucky's arms directly towards his face. And I think that really helped the jury see that this wasn't an isolated colossal mistake. There were a series of mistakes, of negligent mistakes that were made that day. And then, of course, the very stark comparisons between the firearm and the taser, I think, really resonated with jurors.
Absolutely. Now, I want to pivot because we have to talk about the two Tacoma, Washington officers who are exonerated now. The officers used a spit hood on Ellis. The device has been involved in several other police-related deaths. What is the ramification? What are the legal ramifications of this practice if there are injuries?
Yeah, unfortunately, they're very hard to prosecute. The reason why is most police departments allow spit hoods to be used. They're supposed to be used to keep a potential suspect from spitting on officers, biting them. But what we've seen is they've been used in other instances that really aren't valid. From a legal perspective, you really don't have any legal claim or retribution you can get unless you can establish that those officers didn't follow their own department's policies in the use of the spit hood. But that even still doesn't always guarantee legal redress. For instance, Daniel Prude, we know, died of a spit hood that was put over his head in Rochester, New York. And even though body cam footage showed that at no point in time did Daniel Prude spit on officers, he didn't even spit on the ground, yet those officers were cleared as well.
With the clearing of these two officers, what's the probability that the other officers will also be cleared?
It's highly probable. For some reason, right now in America, spit hoods or deaths are given a pass. And this is despite the fact that 10 people have died in police custody that we know of by spit hoods just in the past decade. Again, that's that we know of. And so what it's going to take, Mark, is for more attention and pressure essentially to be put on law enforcement, as we saw with the knee to the neck procedure that was used, or technique to kill George Floyd. The same pressure has to be put on these police departments with these spit hoods because they're being used out of department policy. And the reality is Black men are dying from these spit hoods.
Now, let's go last to the Kentucky Task Force issuing new recommendations. Do you think they will help prevent future cases like the one we saw with Breonna Taylor? I mean, is there any reason for optimism at all in this case?
I want to be optimistic, but the reality is, as we know, history tends to repeat itself. And you can have policies and practices in place, but you got to have a strong enforcement tool. What we've seen for years with law enforcement, they'll have a policy and they ignore their own policy. They look out for their own. We need officers to hold each other accountable. When you're out in the field and you see that they're not following a policy, one of your co-officers, they need to speak up because we can't have eyes and ears everywhere. So although I applaud the fact that the task force is trying to put things in place to create better policing, more equitable policing in our communities, you've got to have a strong enforcement tool. So I'm a big fan of civil review boards for misconduct complaints and so on, but it definitely takes a village.
Absolutely. Now, one of the recommendations is having prosecutors review and approve search warrants. Obviously, there are going to be folk on the law enforcement side who say, no, that's problematic. That slows things down. It's too, it politicizes the process. What do you say?
I agree. I mean, we all know it's no big secret that there's an incestuous relationship between prosecutors and police officers. They work together. A lot of them are so close, they're having dinner at each other's homes. That's why we often have to bring in special prosecutors, as we saw with the killing of Ahmaud Arbery, to even bring charges for it. So am I supposed to trust these prosecutors now to do the right thing in terms of throwing out warrants that shouldn't be issued? So again, civilian task force, we need a civilian review board. We need people in the community that are helping to review these things. That's how you bring about real substantive change. We have to have a seat at the table.
Absolutely. A seat at the table indeed. Laura McNeil, it's always good to have you at our table. We appreciate you. We love you. You are such an important contribution to BNC and certainly to Black News Tonight. Everybody, stay here and make sure you join the conversation while you're here. We want to hear from you, so head over to BNC's Instagram and Twitter pages. Let us know how you feel. Also, visit our website, bnc.tv, and subscribe to our YouTube channel to check out clips from the show. We got much more coming up. I'm going to revisit an important discussion that I had with a very brilliant and famous Pan-Africanist. You're going to get to hear Professor P.L.O. Lumumba and his historically sound take on the African Union's decision to grant observer status to Israel. Don't go anywhere.